Hello and welcome to this week's Cover Stories podcast. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher, Suzanne Kelly. This week I'm raiding the Admiral's bookshelf. Admiral Jim Stavridis, who of course served as a former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, now serves as a managing director and partner at the Carlyle Group, and is chair of the board of trustees at the Rockefeller Foundation, somehow still finds enough time to write books. In this latest one, the Admiral's Bookshelf, he's sharing 25 books that really impacted him over the course of his career, helping shape the way he thought about leadership. I couldn't wait to dive in on this one. It is my great pleasure to welcome Admiral Jim Stavridis into the Cipher Brief studio, but also joining us here for the Cover Stories podcast. His new book, and I'm going to have to ask him in just a moment what number this one is because I've lost count. His new book is The Admiral's Bookshelf, and I have to tell you, I am so excited about this because it's a true leadership book, and he details 25 books for aspiring leaders that they should read that cover, and he tells you exactly what to look for in each book. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Admiral, welcome.
Good to be with you, and the magic number is 15. This is my 15th book.
It's pretty amazing. I mean, you had a full career, obviously retiring as Admiral in the Navy. You were writing some fiction books and some nonfiction books. When did you decide or realize that you're really an author?
In high school, I got to tell you, I was that kid who was the editor of the high school newspaper. I just always loved the immediacy of journalism. Background, of course, that you, Sharon, are much more mature than I am as a journalist. But Suzanne, if I had not gone to the Naval Academy, my plan was to go to either Columbia, Northwestern, or randomly the University of Missouri. Those are the three top schools of journalism in the United States. So I've always loved writing, but I think the question vis-a-vis this book, The Admiral's Bookshelf, is reading is the absolute cornerstone of being a good writer. People ask me, you know, you've published 15 books, a couple of thousand articles. What's the secret to writing? And the secret to writing is reading.
Yeah. And with this particular book, it's different from some of the other ones you've written because you're really sharing a lot of the leadership books that you read that inspired you.
Yeah.
And you've chosen 25 books. I'm really curious to know, how did you even start? I mean, you're sitting in front of a bookshelf right now of how many thousands of books it looks like?
5,000 books in my library.
5,000 books. How did you even start to whittle that down to 25?
Yeah, I did three things. Number one, like anybody would in this circumstance, I jumped on the internet and said, what are the best 100 books ever written? What are the best 50 novels ever written? You know, I just gave my Chat GPT a homework assignment of kind of culling it down. And I went through dozens of websites. And if you Google best books ever, you'll see 2 million websites because people love to talk about books, right? They love to read, love to talk about books. So that enabled me to kind of get it down to around 100 books because I would go through the list and say, I read that book, meant a lot to me. Take an example. I always say the greatest book of leadership ever written was The Godfather by Mario Puzo. And one of the many leadership lessons in that book is he says to his hot-headed son, Santino, the Don says, don't make the mistake of hating your enemies. It clouds your judgment. Boy, is that a good line. And so each of the books on the list were a book that really spoke to me that I could boil down to a quick leadership aphorism. And then I wrote a little mini essay for each one of the 25 books. But it started with the internet. Then the next task was, which of those books have I read? And then the third task was to link it to some very elemental aspect of leadership.
Well, I'm going to stick with The Godfather for a minute because it's fascinating. This is the second chapter of your book, and there are lessons with each of these books. So I also want to talk to you about it in just a moment. But the lesson for The Godfather was pick the right people. Talk to me about that.
Sure. And what's the hardest choice anybody could ever make? It's choosing among your children. And so here's the Don who has these three sons who are each of them a wonderful literary archetype. Santino, the big, strong Sicilian bull, powerful, capable, direct, but loses his temper, gets angry. Second son is the incredibly ineffectual Fredo, which has become almost an insult in the Italian-American community to say, oh, you're a Fredo. And as those who really have followed the sequence of the books know, Fredo ultimately betrays the family in his weakness, his spinelessness, his flippity-floppiness. And then there's that third son, Michael, who the war hero, who goes off to war, wants nothing to do with the family business, just wants to marry Kay, have a real life, get away from it all. But his character pulls him back, particularly after the attempted assassination of the Don. So you have these three sons, and really, in so many ways, this is a book about the Don's leadership choice for the family. And he starts by making a mistake. The Don does. He picks Santino. But he comes to realize that that was a terrible mistake. The right choice ultimately reveals itself to the Don. And of course, it's Michael. So the aphorism of The Godfather is pick the right people. Spend more time on that as a leader than anything else.
I have to ask you, just, thinking about while you're describing that, thinking about your own experience in the Navy and all of these years and all of these teams that you have worked with, it's got to be difficult sometimes assessing the skills, especially in the military where you kind of get the people who are there. I mean, you get to a certain level and you pick the people around you, but what are some of the lessons that you brought to that from your own experience in the military? Yeah,
let's back up if we can for 1 second and make the observation that again and again in military history, the general or the admiral you start the war with is not the one that you want. And ultimately, and the classic example of this, of course, is Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War, who goes through 4, 5, 6 generals to lead the Army of the Potomac, the main strike force of the northern forces. And ultimately, he finds Ulysses S. Grant. The general he starts with is not the right general to prosecute that war. He has to pick. Or think World War II. Pearl Harbor happens, and 2 very honorable, capable flag officers, one Navy, one Army. This is husband Kimmel is the admiral and Short is the general at Pearl Harbor. And they miss the attack coming, and they have to be fired. And so Roosevelt and Ernie King pick Nimitz, the most important strategic choice, I would argue, for the entire war. And so there's a rich tradition of that. In my own life and career, I'll give you a practical example. When I went down to U.S. Southern Command in charge of all military activity south of the United States, it became clear to me very quickly, Suzanne, I did not have the right key job operations officer. You really needed someone who understood the theater, preferably spoke Spanish. And so I looked at dozens of records, and here's the punchline. It became clear to me that what I needed was not a Navy 2-star admiral or an Air Force 2-star general. I needed a Coast Guard officer. Because they're so close to the maritime communities. And so I picked an amazing 1-star, had just promoted to 2 stars, later became a 3-star, I think was a runner-up to be the commandant. All the Coasties listening will know him. Now Vice Admiral Rob Parker. So it's an example of where, the system is telling you, oh, put an admiral here, or maybe an Air Force general, because of the size and the scope and scale of U.S. Southern Command. But for me, the right choice was a Coastie, and I found the right person in Rob Parker.
I think that's fantastic that, you've kind of touched really on something that I think a lot of people deal with in the private sector too, especially in startups, which is the CEO or whoever launches a company isn't necessarily one who can grow it. So you're looking at the skill sets there, and that's what you've just described in that example, and I love that. You yourself have served in some of the most high stakes leadership roles that are out there. I'm wondering how sort of books have helped you navigate some of these restless seas, playing on the title of one of your earlier books, The Restless Wave.
Indeed it is. I think on this list of 25, one of the leadership aphorisms is know your profession. And so whether you're, as you just used a business example, maybe you're a banker at Goldman Sachs, or maybe you're a private equity woman working at the Carlyle Group, where I'm currently a partner, or maybe you're a fire chief, maybe you're a naval officer. You ought to spend time reading the literature of your profession. These are all professions. And the book that's on the list that really worked for me is a single volume history of the United States Navy, written by a Captain Ned Beach, who I got to know, a remarkable figure. And he also, by the way, wrote both nonfiction, Know Your Profession, the United States Navy book, but he also wrote novels. He wrote, most famously, he wrote the great submarine novel of World War II. And he's kind of an all-field runner, if you will. So I think for anybody in a profession, you want to know the history, you want to read the literature of it, the fiction that comes out of it. It's helped me immensely to understand it. And then secondly and finally, if you're going to be a naval officer and be engaged around the world, you have to know what's happening in the world. So there's a whole series of kind of books about the world today that I would recommend to anybody. Fareed Zakaria comes to mind, but many of the authors who appear on your show, Suzanne, are people who've written amazing geopolitical books about what's happening in the world today. You know, of course, I do as well, two-star Admiral Mike Studeman, who is a brilliant observer of all things China, Pacific. His book about China is remarkable and deeply readable, for example.
Mm-hmm. Those are great examples. But you also have some on here that aren't what you might think you would have suggested. One of them, Chapter 10, you're encouraging people to read this book to focus on thinking independently and how important that can be, is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. That's not what I would expect from you.
Yeah, she's one of my 2 or 3 absolute favorite authors. She's Canadian. She's written, I want to say 24 books. She's a 2-time Booker Prize winner, which is kind of the Oscars of books. Remarkable writer. And the book that most readers will know is The Handmaid's Tale, which, of course, is a story about a vicious patriarchy that dominates women in a society in a kind of a near post-apocalyptic moment, made into, very famously, a television series, which is pretty good. The book is so powerful because it's about, set aside the gender issues in it, which are powerful and real, but it's really a book about challenging authoritarians. Mm-hmm. And that's, do you think that's a lesson for today as we look around the world at Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping and Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela and too many other places, Kim Jong-un of North Korea? So I think that book encourages a spirit of resistance against authority, and therefore I included it on the list.
Mm-hmm. A lot of books today, people just don't take the time to read. They will wait for it to come out, on Netflix or choose your channel these days. There are so many to choose from. But you were raised, actually, you talk about this a little bit in the introduction to your book. You were raised in a very different environment. And I'm wondering if you feel like you had an advantage by not having a device in your phone that would give you an instant answer or a television show instead of reading the book. How did that affect you?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I grew up, as you might expect from my last name, Stavridis. I lived in Athens for over 3 years when I was a young boy. My dad, Greek-American, fluent Greek speaker, Marine Corps major, was the assistant naval attaché at the embassy in Greece. This is in the 1960s, and here's the punchline. there's no television in Greece, no English-speaking television. There's only primitive Greek television. So no access to television in the years when I'm 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, when most kids are developing a television habit in those years, in the 1960s, long before the internet. I developed a reading habit. And so my mom, who is herself an incredible reader, and by the way, she's 95 and reads at least 2 books a week. I mean, she's remarkable mental acuity. She made sure I had access to endless numbers of books. And so I just became a reader, and it's really influenced the course of my life, making me, therefore, as we talked about a moment ago, I think a far better writer, and also someone who is prone in moments of crisis and challenge. Hey, there must be a book about that. And you kind of reach for that. Today's world, the internet, I'm not a Luddite who says, oh, never use the internet. You know, make sure you get a dusty book off your bookshelf. No, use them together. And that's, as we started the conversation, how the idea of the Admiral's bookshelf, the book itself, unfolded.
You know, I mean, you talk about your mother's sort of mental acumen at the age of 95 years old. And I have to wonder, I mean, just not only given your military career, but you seem able to recite almost everything from memory. Has that always been something? Do you have a photogenic memory or
photographic?
What's it called? Thank you.
Photographic memory. I do not. A photographic memory is extraordinarily rare and really a profound skill. Think the protagonist in Good Will Hunting, who could read thick volumes and then recite by page number full paragraphs. He does that in a fabulous bar scene before getting ready to punch out the snooty kid from Harvard, and he wins Minnie Driver over to his side. It's a really cool scene about photographic memories. I wish I had one. I do not. I do have a very, very, very good memory. And I'll tell you where that, I think, kind of came from. Another part of my long misspent youth, in addition to writing articles, I was that kid in high school who acted. So I was in plays. You know, I played Polonius in Hamlet. I played Hamlet in a shorter version of that play. I played Mark Antony. I played a lot of Shakespearean parts. And, you know, the ability to memorize and to hold words in your head, I think comes partly out of being on a stage. And by the way, as you know, I'm very comfortable speaking and presenting. I think those are just 2 gifts that came along to me through early years of writing and acting.
Yeah. I have to ask you, which is your favorite child, which I know is difficult, but do you have a favorite on this list of 25 books?
I do, and I made it number 1, and that is Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. And it's as perfect a book as has ever been written. I'll tell you why. First, it's lean, it's simple. Every word carries freight. Every word packs emotion. It's beautifully crafted. Everything, the fit and finish of it are just perfect. Secondly, the theme, really 2 themes are so profound and important. And the first, the little leadership aphorism is the most obvious. It's never surrender. This is the story of Santiago, a Cuban fisherman. He's failing in many ways, but he goes out to sea in his small skiff. He captures this massive, massive fish. And as he tries to bring it back to land, the sharks, the tiburones, come after it and bite it and chew it. And by the time he gets it back, there's nothing left but this huge skeleton. In the book, Hemingway uses the line to describe all that. He says, a man can be destroyed, but not defeated. Meaning, it's about your resilience. To switch to Greek mythology, Sisyphus always pushing the boulder to the top of the mountain, knowing it's going to roll back down. The question is not whether the boulder will roll back down on you. The boulder rolls down on everyone. The question is, do you have the will, the resilience? Do you have the Santiago-like ability to put your shoulder to the stone again and again. It's a perfect book. And then the other theme, which people don't track as much, is that of mentorship. Santiago has mentored this young Cuban boy, and by the end of the novel, those tables have turned, and it's the young boy who is now going to take care of Santiago. And then finally, why does Admiral Stavridis like a book called The Old Man and the Sea? Because I'm an old man and I spend a lot of time at sea, I guess. But I just love any book about the oceans and the sea and the challenges. So for me, yeah, that's my favorite child, although I deeply love every single book on this list.
It's so funny. I have this vision of just, you and Ernest Hemingway all snuggled up in a bar having a conversation about, and I would just love to be a fly on the wall for that conversation. I can see it happening.
The closest you can come to that, and you mentioned it, is to read my novel, the previous book, The Restless Wave, in which Ernest Hemingway appears in I think a really engaging scene in Sloppy Joe's, his favorite haunt in Key West in the 1930s. And in that scene, you see both the power and the scale and scope of Ernest Hemingway. You also see the anger, the temper, the ability to fly off the handle, which are very real for Ernest Hemingway, not his best side. And I think that it's important that we understand him, in all the dimensions. But as a writer, top of my list.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite scenes in that book, by the way, the sort of historical fiction. You reimagined what it would be like to be having a conversation in a bar with Ernest Hemingway. It was fascinating.
Yeah, and don't forget, that is also the place where he meets his, let me stop and count, his third wife, Martha Gellhorn, who is a war correspondent, believe me, a character in full, could go toe-to-toe with Ernie Hemingway. And so you have the added bonus of seeing Martha Gellhorn, who I think is one of the most interesting writers and journalists of the 20th century.
Yeah. So that book is called The Restless Wave. You have something on here that I think is important to leadership, especially in a time when everybody is sort of overwhelmed with media. You've mentioned that you're very comfortable. Not everybody is, not all leaders are, but your book is It Worked for Me by Colin Powell, and you're really kind of promoting this idea of being your own spokesperson.
Yeah.
Why is that such an important part of leadership today?
Yeah, because it shows the courage, the sincerity, and a word we're using more these days, and I think it's a good word, the authenticity. And so often our public figures, you feel as though they're kind of manufactured by influencers and people who give them one-liners and throw them on TikTok for 15 seconds, and somebody you feel is kind of shaping them. I feel that about so many public figures, from very, very senior ones to people that I meet around the country club or at business meetings. People just don't feel, to me, as authentic, perhaps, as they once were. And I think Colin Powell was a throwback to that idea of course I'll get up in front of the cameras. Of course I will answer the questions. General Powell, by the way, was a real-life mentor to me. I met with him many, many times. Back here in this library, I have, I think, 6 different first editions of his works inscribed by General Powell to me. And he would always say about media, because I would say, sir, I'm kind of nervous. I think this is when I was like a Navy captain or a 1-star. And he would almost literally pat me on the head and say, it's okay, Jim. They get to pick the questions, but you get to pick the answers. Yes. And I just, I hold that in mind when I go on camera with anybody these days. It's, okay, if I don't quite like where that question's taking me, I'll turn left. And secondly, General Powell, if you think back to Desert Storm, he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he had this very mercurial 4-star general Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, I think was his name. Big, huge. He was like the Santino of the Department of Defense. And Colin Powell to me was like the Michael. He was like very smart, saw 6 moves ahead of everybody, just had all the right instincts. And General Powell, would jump in when Stormin Norman was given this big pompous briefing about something. And General Powell would step in and say, we're going to find the Iraqi army, we're going to encircle it, we're going to cut its head off, and we're going to kill it. And those are brutal words, but war is brutal. And Colin Powell had that direct authenticity that I've tried to learn from in my own approach to media. But his book, the one you mentioned, it worked for me. Again, is indicative of his humility. And the book is just a series of stories and short vignettes about techniques and ideas that work for him as a leader. I highly recommend it, as I do his autobiography. I think it's called My American Journey. Both of those books are extraordinary, but it worked for me as very short, very tight, very readable. If you haven't read it, it's a good book.
Yeah, some of the books on here, the one, for example, coming in at chapter 13, The Art of War by Sun Tzu, is something I would expect you to write about. Right. It's such a classic, and there's so much to be taken from that book. But you also have another one of my favorites on here about Know the Borders, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, which is on my favorite list as well.
Yeah, it's about the absurdity of war. In so many ways, it may be the greatest anti-war novel ever written. And it's about a bomber group in World War II where if you go to the command and you say, I just can't fly these missions anymore, I'm too burned out, the catch in the Catch-22 is that if you're understanding of how crazy it all is, you're actually sane, and therefore you must continue flying. So it's kind of a no way out book, and it's funny, it's sad, it's tragic, and boy is it real in terms of war. There's another book on the list, by the way, that has nothing to do with war, but is one of my favorites. It's a great title, A Confederacy of Dunces. A Confederacy of Dunces. And it's by John Toole. And it's a story of a hot dog salesman in New Orleans. And this hot dog salesman is a huge character, but it's a book about humor. It's about how you use humor in difficult situations. It's about kind of when things are the darkest, humor can help you and save you. It's a beautifully realized book, has nothing to do with war, but has a lot to do with life. And by the way, here's where the title comes from, A Confederacy of Dunces. And it's a great line. It's from Jonathan Swift, the British philosopher and writer. He wrote Gulliver's Travels. But Jonathan Swift said, and so you shall know there is a genius amongst you, because he will be opposed by a confederacy of dunces. That's a pretty good line if you stop and think about it.
That is a pretty good line. Toni Morrison made your list. That surprised me. Did it surprise you?
No, she's, an absolute first-rate, top-of-the-list kind of writer. The only problem there was picking the right book. And I, for one, find her writing so interesting, and she uses magical thinking, magical images in ways that are just powerful and profound, and also, gives enormous voice to the African American experience in the United States. That's part of why I put it on the list. Despite all the twists and turns of DEI and ESG, etc., the African American experience, no matter how you score it, is a fundamental part of the American journey for these 250 years. And to not understand it and learn it, regardless of how you fit it into your life, would be a travesty. So, yeah, of course, Toni Morrison is on the list.
Yeah. I'm curious to know, how have you seen, or how would you recommend to young folks coming up through the military, or even, quite frankly, in the private sector, How would you recommend they use this book, The Admiral's Bookshelf, to their advantage? I mean, you see sometimes people making references here and there, but this is almost a complete guide to some of the best works out there. How do you suggest they use this book?
Well, it's a very short book by design, so it's something you can throw in your briefcase, your backpack, your knapsack, and for each of these 25 books, it's a little snapshot of the book, and you can read each one of these chapters in a matter of minutes, but it'll get you thinking about the leadership aphorism that's in it. And what I hope people will do is two things. One is they'll most obviously use the book to find their way to some incredible work of art, some incredible book that illuminates a point. I'll give you an example. Physical fitness, which is near and dear, hopefully, to the military way of thinking. Think The Boys in the Boat by a man named Daniel Brown is really about a rowing team in the 1930s, but it's really a book about what physical fitness brings. So might be a book that you hadn't read or thought about. So first, I hope the book can guide you to one of these 25 books, and try and read a couple of books a year, and maybe you'll find a good one on this list. And then secondly, at the very end, Suzanne, and I'm going to turn the tables on you in a minute and ask you this. At the end of the book, the last chapter is called What's on Your Bookshelf? Yeah. Meaning I put a lot of time and effort into finding 25, I think, pretty powerful books that have helped shape my life and serve as a bit of a guidepost. But I challenge in the final chapter any reader to say, what's on your bookshelf? What's the Cipher brief bookshelf or the Suzanne Kelly bookshelf? Yeah. And I talk about where we started this conversation, how you do it, how you winnow down, how you get it down to, 100, down to 50, and then down to 20, or maybe your bookshelf has 3 books on it. I don't know. So tell me a book on your bookshelf as we wrap up this wonderful interview.
Oh my gosh, there's so many that it's very difficult for me to choose one. I'm not sure if I can. I might be too ADD to do it, but you have so many on your list that were my favorites. I mean, I love The Great Gatsby. That's definitely one of my favorites. I love The Guns of August. Oh, yeah. But I'm a huge Toni Morrison fan as well. Yeah. I mean, I don't just read in the genre, although that's what most of the books on my bookshelf are from the genre. But another fantastic author in this sort of Toni Morrison level is Zora Neale Hurston. Oh, it was one of my all-time favorites. And I took a literature class on African-American literature in college, and I've never forgotten that. For whatever reason, that one class really stuck with me. I couldn't tell you much about economics anymore, but I can tell you about African-American literature, so that's always...
Yeah, while we're on that subject, a contemporary writer, and Zora Neale Hurston is a Floridian, so I've read a fair amount of her work. It's very powerful and real to the state as well. But a contemporary writer that I admire a lot is Colson Whitehead. He wrote The Underground Railroad most recently, which is kind of Toni Morrison-like, but he also writes novels about gangster wars in Harlem in the 70s. Really powerful writer. I think he's kind of the next Toni Morrison coming along.
All right, I'm jotting him down right now as we speak. My final question to you, if you could assign one book that you wanted all the world leaders to read today, I mean all of them, what would it be?
It's an easy one for me. It would be the book 1984 by George Orwell. And the aphorism that goes with that is, see the danger. And as I look at the rise of authoritarian states, authoritarian tendencies, even within democracies, we ought to be worried about the far end of that trend line, where truth doesn't matter anymore, where you just repeat something over and over again, where you take complete control. I wish every world leader would sit down, read that book, and see the danger. 1984 by George Orwell. easy choice, unfortunately.
This book is called The Admiral's Bookshelf, and I would suggest that everyone read this book too. I just think you've done such a magnificent job of curating these 25 books and giving people a glimpse of why you felt like these were perfect examples in leadership.
Thank you.
So I'm excited to go back. A lot of them I haven't read for years, and I'm going to go back and try to read all of them.
That's a great final thought, by the way, is we all read books at different phases of our lives. As you get into, in my case, you get into your 60s, you're a completely different person. The Plains Indians say you never cross the same river twice, meaning the river has flowed on. And same with books. You never read the same book again. It's a different book because you're different. So rereading some of these classics, like, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird, is a book that you read when you were 15, and boy, is that full of lessons for life in your 40s and 50s and 60s.
Yeah, you're reminding me now of so many other books. Admiral Jim Stavridis, I just want to come hang out, have a nice cocktail in your beautiful library, and bring all the Cipher Brief readers with me.
That'd be great.
How about that?
Thanks a lot. You can come, you just can't take any books out. This is not a lending library.
That's okay. That's okay. It's so nice to see you, Admiral Jim Stavridis. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Cover Stories podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Suzanne.
You've been listening to the Cover Stories podcast from the Cipher Brief. Thank you so much for subscribing, for being a listener, as we chatted this week about the Admiral's Bookshelf with former Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral Jim Stavridis. We'll see you next time.